In next week's programme about water, David Attenborough embarks on a 4,000-mile journey down the River Amazon, The Living Planet, next Thursday at 8:05. And you may be interested to know that the third and final part of the quiz linked to the Living Planet series can be found in the March edition of the magazine BBC Wildlife, with the South American monkey on the cover, available from newsagents. On BBC 2 shortly, those dear ladies, Dr. Evadne Hinge and Dame Hilda Brackett, decide to liven up the atmosphere in Stackton Trestle by opening a radio station. Here on BBC 1 in 25 minutes, Part 8 of Diana by R.F. Deltafield. That's at 9:25 and follows the 9 o'clock news now with John Humphreys.
Unions concede the government's got its way over Cheltenham, and the handful who've defied the ban. Soccer hooligans a disgrace to Britain, says Mrs. Thatcher. The FA warns we could be banned abroad. Lebanon, now the French to pull out as well. Remarrying in church, another step to help divorced people. And a royal premiere for racing's champion. Good evening. The government has won its fight to get rid of unions at the Cheltenham Communications Centre. The civil service unions have conceded that the vast majority of staff have now signed the government's form, either agreeing to leave their union or accepting a transfer from Cheltenham. But they say they'll fight to restore the unions. They're trying to set up a new society of GCHQ staff, and they say they'll stand by anyone sacked for refusing to sign the government's form. Bill McCall of the Civil Service Union said Cheltenham workers had been subjected to intensive and disgusting pressure by the government. At Westminster, Mrs. Thatcher thanked the majority who'd signed the form. They were now well in excess of 90%, she said. Tonight in Cheltenham, fewer than 100 workers who refuse to leave their union or GCHQ are meeting to plan their next move. Neil Bennett is there.
These are the few GCHQ staff still defying the government. Many have signed what the unions call Option C, which declares that they don't want to leave either their unions or GCHQ. National officials were at a hotel in Cheltenham tonight to promise them continuing support. Only time will tell how the management are going to deal with the people who've signed Option C. For those who have, the campaign has now reached a new and potentially much more difficult phase. Earlier in the day, union official Nancy Dufton was told she'd have to clear her office at GCHQ after 2 years on full-time union business. But she insists that the unions at Cheltenham aren't finished.
As far as we're concerned, there are still people inside this space who want to be trade union members. And so long as those people are there, we are going to be there to represent them.
How are you going to be able to do that from now on?
We have already set into motion some sort of contingency plan. We'll have an office in the town. We will be setting up this office as an advice centre. We will be keeping in touch with our members inside the base as well.
As far as you're concerned, is it now all over or not?
Not at all. It's only just beginning as far as I'm concerned.
The officer who'll be maintaining the union presence in the town has now arrived at Cheltenham. He has no idea how long he'll be required or indeed be able to offer his services.
The unions have waged a skillful and determined campaign over GCHQ, but it wasn't enough to force the government to back down. Their only hope was to persuade 10% of the Spy Centre's workforce, that's about 700 people, to refuse the government's terms. Sir Brian Tovey, the former GCHQ director, admitted this would threaten the whole operation, but it was not to be.
It's now pretty obvious that the government have forced sufficient people to sign their option to enable them to continue the GCHQ operations. That's sad. We acknowledge it to be sad. We don't criticize our members at all. They have been subjected to intensive and disgusting pressure.
It could take months before staff staying in unions leave GCHQ, and the government, having been accused of inflexibility, now seems to be treading carefully.
It's clear now that the vast majority have accepted, and now obviously it will be necessary to try and handle the other problems and people who have strong views of principle, to handle those as sympathetically and as understandingly as it's possible to do, because a decision having been taken, and that having been supported by the vast majority of the people there, that's obviously what's now got to happen. That's the way it's going to go on. But certainly I shall be very anxious to see, as far as it comes within my powers, to see that this is handled in a sympathetic and sensible manner.
There could yet be problems. Some people will never give up their unions, but the government's obviously anxious not to create any union martyrs. So Mrs. Thatcher's got her way. The unions say she always held the best cards and that hers is a hollow victory.
English football hooligans have been condemned by Mrs. Thatcher. After the violence at last night's match in Paris, she said the small minority of fans were a disgrace to their country, and she called for strenuous efforts to stop it happening again. In Paris, Madame Avis, the French sports minister, said the violence distorted sport's spirit of friendship between people. And as the clean-up began, a French radio commentator suggested that if Britain wanted compensation for the lorry drivers' strike, then France should send a bill for the damage. David Cass was at the match.
The French FA tried and almost succeeded to create a total segregation of English camp followers. Significantly, the bulk of the chair throwing, begun by French hooligans, and the fighting, which involved both sets, was in an area to which English youths had gained an unwelcome access. As running fights continued during the match, a party of school children was evacuated. With most of the children removed, that small area was ready for the entry of the CRS riot police. Their strong-arm tactics for once welcomed by Parisians as they dished out their own distinctive style of justice. On their return, some of England's legitimate supporters blamed French hooligans more than the English.
French supporters were really out of order. They ripped all the seats out, they threw them at the English supporters, and English supporters fought back, didn't they? Yeah. That's about what started it. There was no backup from the police. The police never stopped any fighting throughout the whole game. They let them all fight, they let people get beaten up badly, and then, after that, they weighed him in the batons and they indiscriminately battered anybody. Fair, isn't it?
The FA party returned with a grim warning of possible reprisals.
Well, there could be a total ban on English fans and English football. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation, isn't it?
The sports minister has appealed again to European governments to do more than merely expel the offenders.
Yes, I have asked other European ministers in Rotterdam, not just the French. I asked all the European ministers to consider last year, when I initiated the paper in January of 1983, that it was no good simply bunging them out on the next ferry, or the next plane, or the next train, or whatever, and that this has happened for far too long in recent years, and that many of them have got away with it.
The French are now cleaning up the evidence, but as if to answer Neil McFarlane's call for more and harder treatment in the courts, they also announced that only 6 youths have been charged following the violence. That will not be enough to satisfy either our government or football authorities.
The government is lending British Aerospace £250 million to develop the new European Airbus, the A320. British Aerospace had wanted to borrow almost twice that amount. Now they say they'll try to raise the rest of the money themselves. It should mean thousands of new jobs in British Aerospace, mainly in Chester, where the wings are assembled. But there'll be more work at other British Aerospace factories too, and possibly 2,000 more jobs elsewhere in the aircraft industry.
At present, the A320 only exists in model form. It won't come into airline service until 1988. But Airbus Industries say there's a world market for 2,000 airliners of this size by the end of the century, and they think the European consortium will win at least 1/3 of those orders. That's why British Aerospace, who build the wings for existing Airbuses, were so anxious to take a quarter share in the new project. The problem was money. They needed more than £600 million, but told the government they could only find 1/3 of that. They asked Whitehall to lend the other £400 million. In the event, they settled for £250 million, and the British taxpayer now has a stake in the plane. So does that mean the government will try to persuade British Airways to place an order?
I think the best thing is for the A320 to persuade British Airways that it's the aeroplane that they should buy. In other words, we want British Airways to have the best aircraft for its route structure. I hope that that will be the A320.
There's one cloud on the horizon, however. Boeing's rival product, the 737-300, is already flying and is available now. British Aerospace are hoping airlines will delay their orders until the A320 is available. In the meantime, today's decision guarantees almost 7,000 British jobs for the next 20 years.
The government got another gloomy set of unemployment figures today, even though the actual number of people without work went down. There were just over 3,186,000 people claiming unemployment benefit last month, a drop of 13,000. But the total should go down more at this time of year, and the seasonally adjusted figure shows a rising trend. It's the second consecutive jump of almost 29,000, putting the underlying total above 3 million for the first time since last April. Both Mrs. Thatcher and her Employment Secretary Tom King called the latest figures disappointing, while Labour's spokesman John Smith said the upward trend was ominous. The government must take radical action in the budget, he said. And tonight, the CBI President, Sir Campbell Fraser, is appealing for a dollop of capital spending in the budget to help industry. More than 2,000 jobs at British shipbuilders look safe for another year. Govan Shipyard on the Clyde has won a £30 million order from the Electricity Board to build 3 large coal-carrying ships. The yard's order books were empty. 1,500 pensioners from all over Britain came to London today. They want a big increase in their pensions to move out of what they call the begging bowl society, and they lobbied Parliament. Neil Kinnock said he'd urge the government to give them a substantial rise, but after meeting Mrs. Thatcher, they said they were disappointed.
Our general impression is that the government is sitting pretty firmly on the idea of no extra expenditure, but this is most unfair to the retired population in Britain.
Eddie Shah has been awarded more than £73,000 in damages from the National Graphical Association. The newspaper owner won his appeal at the High Court after union picketing outside his printing works in Warrington. And David Dimbleby has won his case at the House of Lords against the National Union of Journalists. They'd called a strike at Mr. Dimbleby's newspapers because he'd transferred his printing to a company connected with a firm blacked by the union. The law lords ruled the strike was unlawful. Reports from Paris suggest that French troops will be pulled out of Beirut in the next few days. Last night, the Soviet Union blocked a move to send in a United Nations force to replace the Americans, British and Italians who've already left. And today, the French government said they could not keep up peacekeeping operations for much longer on their own. Keith Graves has been with the French contingent in Beirut today.
The French have always kept a high profile since they arrived here as part of the multinational force in 1982. Theirs has undoubtedly been the most difficult of the tasks undertaken by the MNF. They had the job of trying to keep the two communities from each other's throats in the center of Beirut, along the so-called Green Line separating the Christian East and the Muslim West. And it's cost them dear. 87 of their 1,200-strong force have died in Beirut. But they are still here after the rest of the multinational force have retreated, and despite repeated threats from Muslim extremists to repeat their attack on a French military base last year that killed 58 soldiers. The French presence is vitally important. They opened up the only crossing point between the two sides after the renewed fighting last month, and they keep it open for a few hours each day. Without them, it would close, and more than likely the fighting would intensify again. Until now, their commitment has been unquestioned. Some of their finest fighting units, the Foreign Legion and the paratroopers amongst them, have served with the MNF. But now, with the Soviet veto of a UN presence here, the future of the French force must be in doubt. Officially, Paris says there'll be no hasty decisions. A French spokesman described the Soviet veto as a setback for the UN and the efforts of the non-aligned nations. What he didn't say was that a withdrawal of the French soldiers would be a major setback for Beirut.
President Gemayel ended his talks in Syria without giving details of what he'd discussed, but it's thought to be only a matter of time before he announces that he's scrapped the peace agreement signed last May with Israel. In Beirut, the Druze leader Wally Jumblat said it would make no difference. He won't compromise with Gemayel and he wants him put on trial. In the Gulf War, Iraq today claimed to have destroyed several more Iranian warships and aircraft. Iran denies this, but both sides agree on one thing. There's a big battle still going on, a dozen miles inside Iraqi territory in the marshes north of Basra. For the first time in the recent fighting, independent newsmen have been allowed near the front. This was the aftermath of a major battle 2 days ago in which the Iraqis claimed they'd driven back an Iranian attack. The Iraqis say their amphibious forces took part in the counter-attack and left many Iranians dead. Western newsmen counted over 400 bodies on the battlefield. The Iraqi commander said Iranian casualties had run into thousands and many more had been taken prisoner in the last 3 days of fighting. The Soviet party leader Konstantin Chernenko will be making an election speech at the Kremlin tomorrow. It's the run-up to voting next Sunday for a new parliament, the Supreme Soviet. In Moscow, our defense correspondent Tim Sebastian has been looking at the way elections are conducted, Soviet style.
Whichever way you look, the posters call the Soviet people to their electoral duty. It's real democracy, says the government, but what sort of democracy?
I think you have to understand that elections in this country, of course, are very different from what you're used to in the West and in Britain. It is more, if you wish, a way of showing your support for the government and for the system.
For the young people, the election brings no new expectations, hopes perhaps of improving living standards, but the clear certainty that central policies will remain the same for the foreseeable future. The party and the people are together for life. They vote on a certainty and on a candidate who can't lose. Or can he?
Yes, it happens every time. Last time, something like 192 were not elected.
Out of 50?
Out of many thousand.
Many thousands of candidates?
Yes, all over the country.
And 1,500 land up in the Supreme Soviet?
Yes, approximately.
The men who sell the elections are the propagandists, among them the staff of the newspaper Izvestia, who decide their approach at a daily morning meeting. Here, as in the Supreme Soviet, it's the fine print, not policy, that's discussed. Policy comes from the only political party they have. And Melor Sturua, the foreign editor, sees no argument there.
There is no difference between our classes. We are now almost classless society, the whole society of the Soviet people. That's why only one party expresses the needs and wishes and will of the society.
The candidate is chosen by a factory or public body.
He's a result of a consensus. He's a result of a search for the best candidate. And that's why, of course, the best always wins.
That's the message of the newspapers. You don't even have to buy them. You can read them free of charge on public notice boards. Polling day is Sunday, no doubt about the outcome. The aim of these elections is unity, not competition. The state says everyone wants the same thing and should want the same thing. In their view, argument and squabbling of the kind seen in the West is counterproductive.
The Church of England has moved closer to allowing divorced people to remarry in church, but the governing body, the General Synod, said both a priest and bishop would have to agree.
The Synod voted for the principle of church weddings for divorcees last July, but the proposed vetting procedure for divorcees seeking church marriage was so complex and unpopular that a simpler scheme was called for. But the very idea of changing the church's rules was bitterly opposed by the Bishop of London. He argued that marriage was threatened by the divorce laws.
It is treated in the law and in the courts now as no more than a temporary contract terminable at will. Indeed, by a strange logic, the Law Commission has argued that the great increase in the number of divorces cast doubts upon the validity of the concept of a single marriage as a lifelong union, as if an increase in the number of cases of murder or rape cast doubt upon the fact that they're wrong.
But the reformers had the vital support today of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
It has always been my hope that we could combine the highest doctrine of marriage as a permanent and lifelong relationship with a confident generosity towards those whose marriages have irretrievably broken down in any genuine desire they have to build out of failure and penitence, and to enter into a true Christian marriage.
Police in London are afraid that terrorists from Libya may have arrived in the city with orders to murder other Libyans opposed to President Gaddafi. And as Bill Hamilton reports, they're going on full alert tomorrow.
A few days ago, a group of revolutionary students seized control of this building, demanding a change in relations between Libya and Britain. Those behind the coup are still occupying the Libyan People's Bureau. Tonight, though, they were denying all knowledge of reports that agents of Colonel Gaddafi's regime have arrived in Britain and could be planning a number of attacks in London tomorrow. But intelligence reports reaching Scotland Yard's special branch have suggested that hit squads are in the capital. They are now contacting dozens of those whom they feel are at risk, and they'll be putting them under special guard tomorrow. Scotland Yard have put out an all-stations alert, and hundreds of uniformed and plainclothes officers will be involved in tomorrow's operation. They'll be guarding particularly sensitive locations, including the Regent's Park Mosque, where a leading Libyan dissident was shot dead in 1980. Other Libyans and those who sell Arab newspapers are being warned to take special precautions tomorrow, the 7th anniversary of the founding of the People's Congresses in Libya.
A big hunt is going on at Stockport in Greater Manchester for a man who raped 2 10-year-old girls last night. He told them he'd lost his dog and asked them to help him find it. Then he led them to a piece of waste ground near their homes where he tied them up and raped them. One of the little girls is still in hospital recovering from her injuries. The polling stations in Chesterfield close in just under 3/4 of an hour. The turnout in the by-election could be quite high, around 70%. A record 17 candidates are contesting the seat, the results expected at around 2 in the morning. Newsnight will stay on the air on BBC2 to bring you the result and first reactions, and there'll be full reports in tomorrow's breakfast time. Scientists from Surrey University watched their new satellite go into orbit this evening with the help of a free launch by the American space agency NASA. It was one of 2 satellites launched from California, and the information it sends will be used by schools and radio enthusiasts, as well as by the scientists.
It must be something of a world record. A satellite designed, built, tested and launched, all within just 5 months. On board are a number of experiments, including one to measure cosmic dust particles. Amateur radio enthusiasts and others will be able to tune into the satellite and hear a human voice from a synthesizer giving some of the experimental results. The launch, watched by scientists at the Surrey University Control Centre, went well.
5, 4, 3, 2. We have ignition and we have a liftoff.
The satellite cost just £300,000, well under what you might expect.
Well, what we're trying to do is to reduce the cost at which it's necessary to do any sort of spacecraft activities, such that relatively small spacecraft can be made inexpensively, and that opens up a whole new vista for British industry.
The satellite circles the Earth every 98 minutes. It's expected to last for 3 years.
The Football League say they're optimistic that Charlton Athletic can be rescued. The Charlton chairman, Mark Hullier, resigned tonight to make way for a property consortium who say they can meet all the league's conditions for keeping Charlton going. The Oxford United chairman, Robert Maxwell, is now set to become chairman of Derby County as part of another rescue deal. Like Charlton, Derby's debts include more than £100,000 of unpaid tax. Cricket and England have chosen 2 spinners, Vic Marks and Nick Cook, to play in the first test against Pakistan in Karachi tomorrow. But there's no place for opener Chris Tavares. Gatting will open. The full side, Willis, Smith, Gatting, Gower, Lamb, Randall, Botham, Marks, Taylor, Cook and Cowans. You'll be able to see highlights of the tour in BBC News bulletins from tomorrow. The Queen Mother is at the premiere of the film Champions tonight. It tells the true story of how the jockey Bob Champion battled against cancer and recovered to ride to victory in the Grand National.
The Queen Mother's deep affection for racing is well known, and so too is her admiration for Bob Champion. She talked at length to the former jockey before taking her seat in the cinema, and to the actor who plays him, John Hurt. The film tells the story of Bob Champion's courageous and successful fight against cancer, from the moment the disease was diagnosed in 1979 to the day less than 2 years later when he won the Grand National on Aldenete. And the glitter of tonight's occasion was in sharp contrast to the long and painful ordeal which Champion endured. He was sustained only by his determination to ride again, a determination he shared with Jo, the lady who later married him.
I brought you something.
It's a big one.
Had to be light. It's for when you start riding again.
And Champion did start riding again. 15 months after leaving hospital, he rode Aldeniti to one of the most memorable victories in racing history.
Aldeniti is going to win it. At the line, Aldeniti wins the National. Spartan Missile is second. Royal Mail is just third ahead of 3-1.
A highly popular victory by two highly respected champions. And the idea for a feature film was born.
And the main stories again. The unions have conceded that the vast majority of staff at Cheltenham have signed the government's forms, but they say they'll fight to restore union membership at the Spies Centre. And Mrs Thatcher has called the football hooligans a disgrace to their country. The FAs say England may be banned from playing abroad. And that's it for now. The late headlines about 11:45. Till then, good night.
On Breakfast Time tomorrow, Joan Rivers, America's funniest lady, shares the sofa with TV's most popular tough guy, Dennis Waterman. Chesterfield choice, tears and cheers as the election result is announced. Will Princess Di's tuxedo start a high-street fashion revolution? Acne, the causes and cures of the teenager's curse. And gospel music becomes the hottest sound around. Breakfast Time tomorrow from 6:30.
Good evening to you. If the spring-like weather in the south today made you feel that winter's over, then you're in for a really rude shock, because it's just the opposite. In fact, it all hinges on this area of low pressure. It's deepening like mad now, and as it heads away eastwards, so it's going to introduce these very cold northerly winds blasting down straight from the Arctic. If we look at the satellite picture, you can see that process underway, because a few hours ago